Welcome to Haunted Voice channel for a rainy night. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now let's get started. Camping had always been my escape. The world felt small and manageable in the quiet of the woods under the stars, with just a fire and the sounds of nature. I never imagined something so serene could become so wrong. This time I went alone. I needed the space, the solitude. Work had been stressful, life even more so. My friends had warned me not to go by myself, said it wasn't safe, but I brushed them off. I'd done this plenty of times before. I found a perfect spot, far off the main trail, near a small stream, surrounded by towering trees that blotted out most of the sky. The forest felt ancient, untouched, and utterly still. The kind of place where you could forget the rest of the world existed. I set up camp, built a fire, and settled in as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows through the trees. As darkness crept in, the woods became eerily silent. No animals rustling through the leaves, no distant calls of birds. Just the crackling of the fire and the occasional breeze whispering through the branches. It felt wrong, but I chalked it up to my imagination. Being alone in the wilderness could mess with your head. I decided to turn in early, the exhaustion of the week catching up with me. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, the warmth of the fire outside barely reaching the tent. I drifted off quickly, the quiet of the forest lulling me to sleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but something had pulled me out of a deep sleep. I lay there, disoriented, listening to the silence outside. And then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from outside the tent, somewhere in the trees. At first I thought it was a branch knocking against something, but the sound was too deliberate, too steady. My heart began to race, but I told myself it was probably just some animal, maybe a woodpecker. Though the tapping didn't sound like that either. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening. The tapping would stop for a few minutes, then start again. Always the same pace. Always from the same direction. Eventually, exhaustion won over my fear, and I drifted back to sleep. When I woke the next morning, I felt uneasy. The fire had long since died, and the forest was as still and quiet as it had been the night before. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that something had been close during the night. I walked to the edge of the clearing, trying to see if there was anything unusual in the trees, but there was nothing. No sign of animals, no footprints, just undisturbed dirt and leaves. I convinced myself I was being paranoid. It's easy to get spooked when you're out here alone. Still, I couldn't shake the tension in my chest, so I decided to take a hike to clear my head, get some distance from camp. The forest felt suffocating as I walked, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels, their branches thick and intertwined, blocking out the sun. The trail I followed was barely visible, more of a suggestion than a path winding deeper into the woods. The further I went, the stronger that feeling grew. The sense that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me. Then up ahead I saw it. At first I thought it was a trick of the light or maybe my mind playing games with me. But as I got closer I realized what I was looking at. A tree, its bark stripped away in long, jagged lines, like something had clawed at it. Deep gouges ran down the trunk, fresh enough that the wood beneath was still pale and raw. I stopped dead in my tracks, my stomach twisting. What kind of animal could do that? The claw marks were too large, too deep. It looked more like the work of a person than any creature I'd ever encountered in these woods. As I stood there, staring at the tree, the tapping sound returned. Soft, steady. Tap, tap, tap. This time it was closer. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there. Just the thick, oppressive trees closing in on all sides. The tapping stopped, leaving me in the deafening silence of the forest. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run, to get the hell out of there, but another part of me, the part that's always been too curious for its own good, needed to know what was making that sound. I followed the noise. It led me deeper into the woods, the tapping growing louder, more insistent. My heart raced, my palms sweaty as I gripped the knife I'd brought along, though I wasn't sure what good it would do. The trees seemed to press in closer the further I went, their branches twisting and tangling overhead, blocking out most of the light. And then I saw it. A cabin. Small, run down, almost hidden by the overgrowth of the forest. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, its wooden walls rotting, the roof sagging in places. But the tapping was coming from inside. I should have turned back. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to run. But I didn't. Instead, I approached the cabin, my footsteps barely making a sound in the thick layer of leaves and dirt. The front door was ajar, creaking softly as it moved with the breeze. I hesitated, staring at the dark space beyond. The tapping had stopped again, leaving the woods eerily quiet. I stepped inside. The air inside the cabin was stale, thick with the smell of rot and damp wood. The floor creaked under my weight as I moved further in, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The cabin was empty. No furniture, no signs of life, just dirt and decay. And then from behind me the tapping started again. I whipped around, my flashlight scanning the room, but there was nothing. Just the cabin, empty and silent. Suddenly the door slammed shut, plunging me into darkness. I ran to the door, fumbling with the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me as the tapping grew louder, faster. It was right behind me now, almost rhythmic, like a heartbeat. My breath came in short gasps as I turned, pressing my back to the door, my flashlight shaking in my hand. And that's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, crouched low to the ground, was a figure. Its limbs were long, too long, twisted and wrong. Its skin was pale and slick, like it had been stretched too tight over its bones. It stared at me with hollow, empty eyes, its mouth hanging open in a grotesque grin. The tapping had stopped. It didn't need to make a sound anymore. It was there, right in front of me. I didn't wait. I threw myself at the door, pounding on it, screaming until finally it gave way. I stumbled out into the forest, my legs weak, my mind reeling. I ran, blindly, crashing through the underbrush, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that thing. I don't know how long I ran, hours maybe. By the time I stopped, I was lost, completely disoriented, my camp nowhere in sight. But I didn't care. I just kept moving, putting as much distance between me and that cabin as possible. I never went back for my tent, my gear. I never went back for anything. When I finally made it back to civilization, I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? But sometimes late at night when the world is quiet, I can still hear it. That soft, steady tapping. Camping was supposed to be a way to reconnect with nature, with myself, with the things that really mattered. I had been feeling disconnected from everything lately, so a weekend in the remote wilderness seemed like the perfect solution. My friend Ethan had recommended a secluded spot he'd been to once before, tucked away in a thick forest about 3 hours from the nearest town. No cell service, no noise, just pure isolation. Exactly what I needed. I arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon, the sun already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows between the towering trees. The place was eerily quiet, with only the sound of wind whispering through the leaves and the occasional creak of branches. The campsite was small, nestled by a small lake that looked like glass in the fading light. It was beautiful, but something about the silence felt off. Still, I shrugged it off as nerves. Being so far from civilization was bound to be unsettling at first. I set up my tent quickly, not wanting to be out in the open once night fell. I built a small fire, ate a quick meal, and sat back to enjoy the peace. The sky turned dark quickly, stars peeking out through the canopy above, and the fire crackled softly as I stared into the flames. It should have been peaceful. It should have been calming. But I felt it again, that unsettling sensation, like I wasn't alone. I brushed it off, attributing it to the eeriness of the woods. After all, being alone in a forest at night messes with your head, right? It's easy to imagine things that aren't there. I kept repeating this to myself, trying to push the unease away. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the air had grown cold. I zipped myself up in my sleeping bag and tried to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. The forest was so silent that every tiny noise felt magnified. The rustle of leaves, the creak of a branch. I was acutely aware of every sound, every shift in the air, every distant rustling noise. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal scurrying through the underbrush. But then I heard it. Something soft. Something deliberate. Footsteps. I froze. They were slow, cautious, like someone trying to move quietly but unable to avoid making the slightest sound. My heart raced. Maybe it was just a deer or some other animal, but no, these were too deliberate, too human. The footsteps circled the tent, stopping every few seconds as if whoever, or whatever it was listening, waiting. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. My mind raced through the possibilities. Another camper? But I was miles away from the nearest trail. A ranger? Unlikely this late at night. I stayed perfectly still, listening as the footsteps came closer, closer still, until they were right outside my tent. I could hear the soft crunch of leaves, the faint sound of breathing. Then, nothing. The silence was worse than the noise. It pressed in around me, thick and suffocating. I waited, straining my ears for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no rustling, no sound at all. Minutes passed. I don't know how long I lay there, terrified to move, terrified to even breathe. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless, uneasy sleep. The next morning I woke up early, the events of the night still fresh in my mind. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, blinking in the bright morning light. The forest looked different in the daylight, less sinister, more peaceful, but my sense of dread hadn't faded. That's when I noticed it. The ground around my tent was disturbed. There were footprints, human footprints, leading in a circle around my tent, exactly where I'd heard the footsteps the night before. My heart pounded in my chest as I knelt down to inspect them more closely. They were fresh, made sometime during the night. But what chilled me to the bone was the size of them. They weren't just human. They were small, like a child's. I stood up quickly, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement, but the woods were still, quiet. I couldn't shake the image of those tiny footprints circling my tent, the way they'd stopped right outside. I hadn't heard anyone leave, hadn't heard any footsteps retreating into the woods. Whoever, or whatever, had been out there had vanished without a sound. I debated packing up right then and there, but something in me wanted answers. Maybe it was just another camper, I told myself. Maybe I had imagined it being worse than it was. I decided to stay one more night. Just one. The day passed uneventfully. I fished in the lake, hiked a little, but that uneasy feeling never left me. As the sun set and darkness crept back into the forest, the dread returned full force. I built a fire again, but it did little to comfort me. Every crack of a twig, every gust of wind, made my skin crawl. By the time I crawled into my tent, I was on edge, my senses on high alert. I didn't know if I'd be able to sleep at all. I lay there for hours, listening to the sounds of the forest, waiting for something to happen. And then it did. It started with the footsteps again, slow, deliberate, circling the tent. But this time, there was more than one. I could hear them, light, quick steps, moving in unison around the tent. My heart pounded in my chest. I sat up, clutching the zipper of my sleeping bag, too afraid to move. Suddenly there was a soft whisper just outside the tent, too quiet to make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. A child's voice. Goosebumps prickled my skin. I sat perfectly still, straining to hear, but the whispering stopped. Then, without warning, the tent's fabric shifted. Something, or someone, was brushing against it from the outside. I could see the faint outline of small hands pressing against the nylon, moving slowly around the tent. I grabbed my flashlight, hands shaking, and clicked it on. I pointed it at the walls of the tent, but the moment the beam hit the fabric, the hands vanished. The whispering stopped. Silence. I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent in a rush, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. But there was no one there, just the trees, the quiet, and the small human footprints leading away from my campsite. This time I didn't wait for morning. I packed up in the dead of night and drove until the sun came up, never looking back at the woods behind me. When I got home, I tried to rationalize it all. Maybe I'd been sleep-deprived. Maybe my mind had played tricks on me. But then, a few days later, I found something that made my blood run cold. In the trunk of my car, nestled between my gear, was a single muddy handprint. A child's handprint. I had always been drawn to the solitude of the forest. There's something about being away from people, surrounded only by nature, that gives me a sense of peace. That's why, when a long weekend opened up, I decided to spend it camping in a remote part of a national park I'd never been to before. It was a place known for its rugged beauty and complete isolation, perfect for someone looking to escape from everything for a few days. I set off on a Friday afternoon, driving for hours until the roads turned from pavement to gravel, and finally to dirt. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the dense forest. I should have known better than to hike in the dark, but I was determined to make it to the campsite marked on the map, about 2 miles in. I strapped on my backpack, grabbed my flashlight, and set off. The trail was barely visible, overgrown and winding between towering pines that seemed to swallow up the fading light. The silence of the woods was almost suffocating, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or snap of a twig beneath my boots. There was something unnerving about it, how quiet it was, how the trees seemed to close in on me the further I walked. By the time I reached the clearing where I planned to camp, it was pitch black. I quickly set up my tent, trying to ignore the strange feeling that had been creeping up on me ever since I entered the forest. I kept telling myself I was just jumpy from hiking alone in the dark. Once I had a fire going, I'd be fine. And I was, at first. The flames crackled, sending shadows dancing across the trees, and I began to relax, enjoying the warmth and the faint glow of the stars above. The unease I'd felt earlier started to fade, replaced by the familiar comfort of being alone in the wilderness. But that comfort didn't last. It started with a faint noise, almost imperceptible at first, a rustling in the underbrush, like something moving just beyond the reach of the firelight. I paused, listening intently, but the noise stopped as suddenly as it had started. Maybe a raccoon, I thought. Nothing to worry about. But a few minutes later it came again, louder this time. Closer. I stood up, my flashlight in hand, and shined it into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the thick wall of pines and brush. No movement, no eyes reflecting back at me. Just the deep, impenetrable black of the forest. I sat back down, my heart beating a little faster now. Maybe it was just my imagination, the woods playing tricks on me. But the feeling of being watched, of something just out of sight, grew stronger. It was irrational, I knew that. Yet I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone out here. Then, around midnight, things got worse. I was lying in my tent trying to sleep when I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy, like someone, or something, was walking just outside the tent. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to listen, every hair on my body standing on end. The footsteps circled the tent, shuffling through the dirt and leaves. I gripped my flashlight, every muscle in my body tensed, waiting. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. The footsteps stopped, right next to where my head was resting. The fabric of the tent rippled slightly, as if someone, or something, was brushing against it. I held my breath. Silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, suddenly, a loud thud echoed through the clearing, like something had been dropped or thrown just outside the tent. My heart pounded in my ears. I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent slowly, careful not to make too much noise, and shined my flashlight outside. Nothing. The clearing was empty. But then I saw it, a rock. A large, smooth stone sitting right in front of the tent flap. That wasn't there before. I would have noticed. Someone, or something, had placed it there. I stood up, shining the light around the campsite, my pulse racing. There was no one, no movement, just the stillness of the trees and the faint crackling of the fire. But I knew I wasn't imagining things. Something had been out there. Something had left that rock. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the fire, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent me spinning around with the flashlight, but I never saw anything. The forest seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. When morning finally came, I packed up my gear and decided to cut the trip short. There was no way I was staying another night. As I was packing, I noticed something that chilled me to the core. Around the edge of my campsite there were footprints, human footprints, barefoot. They circled my tent, just like the footsteps I'd heard the night before. But what was even more unsettling was that the prints were small, like those of a child. I hadn't seen anyone else out here, not even on the drive in. There were no other cars at the trailhead, no signs of other campers. So where had the footprints come from? I tried to shake off the fear, telling myself it had to be a coincidence. Maybe someone had been camping here before me. But as I made my way back down the trail, the uneasy feeling only grew stronger. About halfway back to the trailhead, I found something that made my blood run cold. Hanging from a low branch directly above the path was a small wooden doll. It was crudely carved, with a twisted face and long, spindly limbs, and it looked old, like it had been hanging there for years. But I hadn't seen it on the way in. Someone had placed it there after I arrived. My hand shook as I reached up to touch it, as if to confirm it was real. The wood was cold and rough under my fingers. There were no other signs of life around, no footprints, no other campers. Just the doll, swinging slightly in the morning breeze. I didn't stay to figure out who or what had left it there. I ran the rest of the way to my car, not stopping until I was safely inside, locking the doors behind me. As I sped away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something that was watching me the whole time. To this day, I don't know what was out there with me that night, but I've never gone back to that part of the woods, and I never will, because sometimes the things you can't see are the ones you should fear the most. I used to love the wilderness. There was something about getting lost in the vast expanse of trees, hearing nothing but the wind rustling through the leaves, that made me feel free. My friends, Brian, Jess, and I, had been planning this camping trip for months. A weekend away from the noise and chaos of our lives deep in the forest, miles from civilization. We thought it was going to be the perfect escape. I wish we'd never gone. It started like any other trip. We drove for hours until the roads turned to dirt, then parked and hiked further until we were completely isolated. By the time we found a good clearing, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. We set up camp, pitched our tents, and got a fire going. The night came quickly, and the darkness out there was heavy, the kind that makes it hard to see your hand in front of your face if you're too far from the fire. We sat around, talking and laughing, roasting marshmallows. It was perfect, until we heard the first noise. It was distant, a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, but not quite. It echoed from deep in the forest, but none of us could pinpoint exactly where. I remember Jess looked at me, her face half lit by the fire, her eyes wide. You guys heard that, right? Brian shrugged, trying to laugh it off. Probably just an animal. We're in the middle of the woods. Relax. But it wasn't the kind of sound you could just shake off. It had a weight to it, something unnatural. Still, we all tried to ignore it, convincing ourselves that it was nothing. We kept talking, but our voices were quieter, our eyes darting to the shadows beyond the firelight more often than before. Then it happened again, louder this time, closer. Jess stood up, her hands gripping the sleeves of her jacket. "We should check it out," she said, her voice shaky. "What if it's something dangerous?" Brian, always the tough one, grabbed a flashlight. "Fine. I'll check it out. You two stay here." I didn't want to let him go alone. I grabbed my flashlight too and followed him, even though my gut was telling me to stay by the fire. The woods were silent, except for the crunching of leaves beneath our feet. The further we got from the campsite, the more oppressive the darkness became. The trees seemed to close in around us, and that strange noise hung in the air, like it was waiting for us. "Do you see anything?" I whispered. Brian swung his flashlight in wide arcs, lighting up the trees and bushes, but there was nothing. No animals, no movement, just the stillness of the forest. My heart was racing, and I kept thinking about Jess, alone back at the camp. We didn't find anything. Reluctantly, we turned back. The silence between us more unsettling than anything we could have found. But when we got back to the clearing, Jess was gone. The fire had died down to embers, the faint glow barely enough to light the area. Her tent was still there, untouched. Her backpack sat by the fire, unzipped, but there was no sign of her. "Jess?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer. I called again, louder this time, but all I got in return was that same low growl from deep in the woods, closer than it had ever been. Brian looked at me, and I could tell by his face that he was starting to get scared too. "We need to find her," he said. "She wouldn't just leave like this." We grabbed more flashlights, calling her name over and over as we searched. The forest seemed endless, and every sound, every twig snapping, every rustle of leaves, made my skin crawl. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, like eyes were following us from the darkness just out of reach. Hours passed, no sign of Jess. We made our way back to the camp, exhausted and terrified, but as we approached, my heart sank. There were footprints, dozens of them, leading from the edge of the woods straight to the fire pit, and then disappearing, as if whoever or whatever made them had simply vanished. Brian knelt down, shining his flashlight on the prints. "These aren't hers," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They're too big. Way too big." Suddenly we heard something, a soft rustling like someone moving through the trees. We both turned, shining our lights toward the sound, and that's when we saw it. At first it was just a shadow, a shape barely visible between the trees. But then it moved, slowly stepping into the dim light of the dying fire. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its limbs were long, unnaturally thin. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its face... God, its face. It had no eyes, just hollow sockets, and its mouth hung open in a twisted, unnatural smile. Brian froze. I could barely breathe. It stood there watching us, or maybe not watching, since it didn't have eyes, just staring. And then it spoke, or at least it sounded like it was trying to. But the voice that came out wasn't its own. It was Jess's, her voice, pleading, terrified, echoing from that thing's mouth. "Help me, please." Brian took off running before I could stop him. He sprinted into the woods, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he disappeared into the darkness. I tried to follow, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, stuck in place, staring at that thing as it slowly started to walk toward me. I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out because the next thing I knew, it was morning, and I was lying on the ground near the dead fire. Brian was gone. Jess was gone. I was alone. The authorities searched the woods for days, but they never found them. No trace, no bodies. Just me, raving about monsters in the forest. They said it was shock, that I must have imagined it. But I know what I saw. Sometimes late at night I still hear that growl. There's something about camping in the deep woods that always gave me a thrill, a mixture of fear and excitement. But after what happened on that trip last year, I'll never step foot into the wilderness again. It was supposed to be a weekend of adventure, just me, my girlfriend Anna, and our friend Greg. We were headed to a remote area we'd never been to before, about 5 hours from town, in a state park that Greg had read about online. He claimed it was perfect for an off-the-grid experience. No people, no distractions, just us and nature. The drive out was beautiful. Golden fields, winding mountain roads, and eventually the forest swallowed us whole. The deeper we went, the fewer signs of civilization we saw. By the time we reached the trailhead, it felt like we were 1,000,000 miles away from anywhere. The campsite Greg picked was deep in the forest, a 3-hour hike from the trailhead. As we made our way through the trees, the air grew cooler and the canopy above grew thicker, blocking out most of the sunlight. It was peaceful but also unnervingly quiet. No birds, no wind, just our footsteps crunching through the underbrush. By the time we found the clearing, the sun had started to dip below the horizon. We set up our tents and got a fire going, just in time for the first hints of night to settle in. The spot was strange, though. Even though it was deep in the woods, the clearing seemed too perfect. The trees formed a near circle around it, and there were no signs of wildlife. No deer tracks, no birds, not even a squirrel. Just silence. As the fire crackled, we tried to shake off the weird vibes, telling ourselves it was just the isolation playing tricks on us. We joked, ate, and shared stories, but as the night deepened, that creeping feeling of unease returned. I could feel it in my gut, like something was watching us from the trees, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Around midnight, Greg decided to go for a walk to gather more firewood. "Be back in 10, he said, grabbing his flashlight and heading toward the trees. Anna and I sat by the fire, listening to the faint crack of branches as he disappeared into the darkness. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then 30. "Where the hell is he?" Anna asked, her voice tense. "I don't know, maybe he got lost. I'll go find him," I said, grabbing my flashlight. The moment I stepped into the woods, the quiet was overwhelming. It was like the forest was holding its breath. I called out Greg's name, but there was no response. My light barely penetrated the darkness. The trees seemed to loom closer, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal arms. I walked for what felt like ages, but I didn't find any trace of Greg. No footprints, no broken branches. Nothing. The strangest part? I couldn't hear him either. No crunching leaves, no distant voice. It was like he had simply vanished. My chest tightened with panic, and I rushed back to the campsite expecting to find Anna waiting. But when I emerged from the trees, she was gone too. The fire was still crackling, her flashlight resting beside her empty chair. My heart hammered in my chest. I called out her name, shouting louder and louder, but the only answer I got was the echo of my own voice bouncing back through the trees. I grabbed both flashlights and started searching the perimeter of the clearing. The forest felt wrong. The way the trees seemed to twist unnaturally in the darkness. The overwhelming stillness. The smell of damp earth and something rotten, like decaying leaves. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the clearing where Greg had disappeared earlier, there was a faint glow, just barely visible through the dense trees. It wasn't firelight. It was whiter, softer, almost like a mist. My pulse raced as I approached, flashlight trembling in my hand. The closer I got, the more I realized the glow wasn't coming from a light source. It was coming from something else. The trees began to thin out as I reached the source. My breath hitched in my throat when I saw it. A clearing, Another one. Only this one was different. It was smaller, maybe only 20 feet wide, and at the center stood what I could only describe as the remnants of an old campsite. Rotten, collapsed tents, the skeleton of a fire pit, rusted camping gear scattered on the ground, overgrown with moss and vines. And then I saw them, 3 tents much like ours but disintegrating. Something about them seemed eerily familiar. My mind raced. Could this be some kind of forgotten campsite? But it looked ancient, like it had been abandoned for decades. I shone my light over the collapsed tents, and that's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Scattered across the ground, just visible under the layers of leaves and dirt, were old faded photographs. I bent down, picking one up with trembling fingers. It was a picture of 3 people standing in front of a campfire, smiling. My heart stopped. It was us. Me, Anna, and Greg. My hands shook as I flipped through more of the pictures. They were all of us, arriving at the campsite, setting up our tents, sitting around the fire. But they looked old. The edges of the photos were worn, yellowed with time. And then I noticed the last photo. It was of the clearing I stood in now, but there was something horribly wrong. The 3 of us, Anna, Greg, and I, were lying on the ground in unnatural positions, limbs twisted, faces contorted in silent screams. I dropped the pictures, stumbling back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. This couldn't be real. How were these pictures here? And why did they show us dead? Suddenly I heard a voice behind me. Looking for something? I spun around, my flashlight flickering wildly. Standing at the edge of the clearing was Greg, but something was off. His face was blank, his eyes empty, like he wasn't fully there. "Greg, where's Anna?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, the empty expression on his face never changing. Behind him, the trees seemed to shift, shadows moving unnaturally between the branches. I backed away, the flashlight shaking in my hand. "Greg, what's going on? Where's Anna?" But Greg wasn't Greg anymore. He tilted his head slightly, a twisted smile spreading across his face as he stepped into the clearing, his movements slow, deliberate, as if he was being controlled by something else. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't look back. I just sprinted through the trees, the sound of footsteps echoing behind me, growing faster, closer. The forest felt like a labyrinth, the trees closing in, branches clawing at my clothes and skin. I don't know how long I ran before I stumbled onto the trail again, panting and soaked in sweat. I never looked back. I don't even know if Greg, or whatever was chasing me, was still following. I eventually made it back to the car, but I was alone. I called the rangers, told them everything, but they found nothing. No sign of Anna, no sign of Greg. Just an empty campsite and a fire that had long since burned out. That forgotten clearing, it doesn't show up on any maps, but I'll never forget what I saw there, or the photos of us lying dead on the ground. Whoever or whatever took those pictures is still out there, in those woods, waiting for the next group of campers to stumble upon their twisted game. And I'll never go back to find out what happens next. We didn't plan to camp that weekend, at least not at that spot. It was supposed to be just a day hike, a chance for me, Ben, and Lily to get away from the chaos of work and school for a while. But when we found that clearing, that perfect secluded spot near the river, Ben insisted we stay the night. It was too perfect to pass up. In hindsight, I wish we'd just kept hiking. The spot was almost surreal. The river wound through the trees like a silver ribbon, and the dense forest felt like a barrier from the rest of the world. No roads, no people, just us and the wilderness. We set up camp on a patch of soft grass, the canopy above filtering the late afternoon sunlight into a golden haze. It was peaceful, beautiful even. We built a fire as the sun dipped below the horizon, and after a while, the usual camping routine kicked in, roasting marshmallows, telling old stories, laughing. It felt good to be out there, disconnected from everything. But the moment the sun fully disappeared, that feeling shifted. Something about the forest felt wrong. I can't say what triggered it exactly. Maybe it was how suddenly the night closed in around us, the way the trees seemed to press in tighter, as if the darkness itself was alive. Or maybe it was the silence. The sudden, absolute silence. No wind, no crickets, no rustling of leaves, just an eerie stillness. At first we didn't notice it. It was Lily who spoke up, her voice quiet, almost afraid to break the hush. "Do you guys hear that?" We stopped talking and listened. Nothing. The kind of silence that felt unnatural, like the world had been muted. I laughed it off, tried to shake the creeping unease. "It's just the forest. Sometimes it goes quiet," I said, trying to convince myself as much as her. But the look in Ben's eyes told me he wasn't buying it either. He looked over his shoulder, scanning the tree line. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw something move. It was quick, just a flicker of motion at the edge of the firelight, deep in the trees. A figure, I thought. But it was gone as fast as I'd noticed it. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice lower now, tension creeping into my words. Ben nodded, his face pale in the glow of the fire. "Yeah, thought I was imagining it." Lily stood up, looking between the two of us. "What are you talking about?" "Someone's out there," I whispered, not wanting to say it too loud, like admitting it would make it real. For a moment, none of us moved. We just stood there, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight, searching for any sign of movement. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their trunks blending into the shadows, impossible to make out where they ended and the night began. Then the footsteps started, faint at first, like someone treading lightly through the underbrush. They came from deep within the woods, just far enough that we couldn't see the source, but close enough that we all heard it. Lily's eyes widened. "Maybe it's a deer," she suggested, her voice trembling, though she didn't sound convinced. "But deer don't move like that. They don't stop and start the way this thing was doing, circling around us, staying just out of sight." My heart was pounding in my chest, my mouth dry. Something was out there, watching us, and it wasn't a deer. Ben grabbed his flashlight and flicked it on, sweeping the beam across the trees. The light cut through the darkness, but all it revealed were the trunks of trees and the occasional flicker of branches. No figures, no movement. But the sound, the footsteps, continued, slowly circling the camp, like someone, or something, was playing with us. "Who's out there?" Ben shouted, the beam of his flashlight jerking as his hand shook. No response, just the steady crunch of footsteps moving around us. My stomach twisted with a deep, primal fear. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. The silence returned, even heavier now, almost suffocating. Ben lowered his flashlight, his face pale. Lily was gripping my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "I don't like this," she whispered, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "We should go." But go where? We were miles from the nearest road, deep in the forest with only the river as our guide. And in the dark, with whatever was out there, moving felt just as dangerous as staying put. Ben was about to say something when we heard it, a soft, low voice coming from the trees. "Help me." It was faint, almost a whisper, but we all heard it. My blood ran cold. It didn't sound right. The words were clear, but there was something off about the way they were spoken, like whoever, or whatever, was saying them wasn't used to speaking. "Help me." It came again, this time closer, from the same direction as the footsteps. But still, we couldn't see anything. Ben pointed the flashlight toward the voice, his hand shaking. "Who's out there?" he called again, though his voice had lost its bravado. For a long moment, there was nothing. No footsteps, no voice, just the oppressive silence pressing in around us. Then, from the edge of the trees, something stepped into the light. At first, it looked like a person, a man maybe, tall, with long, thin limbs and skin so pale it almost seemed to glow in the dark. But as the flashlight beam hit it, I realized with a growing sense of horror that this thing, whatever it was wrong. Its face was stretched too long, its eyes wide and dark like hollow pits. Its mouth was open, lips too thin, and it smiled, revealing rows of too sharp teeth. It wasn't a person. "Help! Me!" it whispered again, though its mouth barely moved. The voice came from it, but it sounded wrong. Lily gasped, backing up so quickly she almost fell over the fire pit. Ben dropped the flashlight, the beam spinning wildly as it hit the ground. We were plunged into darkness. Without thinking, I grabbed Lily's arm and ran. Ben followed, his footsteps heavy behind us. I didn't care where we were going, just away from the campsite, away from that thing. The footsteps followed us. Not just ours, but those same slow, deliberate steps, keeping pace with us in the trees. We ran, stumbling through the underbrush, the river our only guide. My heart pounded in my chest, my lungs burning, but I didn't dare stop. Every time I glanced back, I could see it, moving between the trees, its pale form flickering in and out of sight, always just behind us. "Help. Me," the voice whispered again, so close it felt like it was right behind my ear. I didn't look back. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. By the time we piled in, all of us were gasping for breath, our faces pale with terror. Ben slammed the car into gear, and we sped down the dirt road, the forest blurring by in the rearview mirror. We never spoke about it after that night. I don't think any of us could. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone and it's quiet, I still hear that voice. "Help me." And I know, whatever it was that we saw in those woods, it's still out there, watching, waiting. We'd been planning the trip for months, a weekend getaway deep in the woods, far from the crowds and the noise of our regular lives. There were 5 of us, me, my girlfriend Emma, and our friends Jason, Lily, and Tom. The goal was simple: hike in, set up camp, drink some beers, tell stories, and disconnect from the world. We found the perfect spot, an isolated clearing near an old, overgrown trail. It was beautiful and untouched, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to swallow the sky. The air was crisp, clean, and filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. Everything was perfect. That first day was normal. We spent the evening setting up our tents, gathering firewood, and cooking over the campfire. As the sun set, the woods transformed. The shadows stretched long and deep, and the temperature dropped quickly. Still, the fire was warm, and the laughter between us was enough to stave off the chill. Around midnight, after a few beers and stories, Tom leaned forward, his face half illuminated by the fire's glow. "You guys heard about this place, right?" he asked, his voice low and conspiratorial. Jason chuckled, shaking his head. "Here we go, another one of Tom's local legends." But Tom's expression didn't break. "No, seriously. This forest used to be part of some old logging town back in the early 1900s. The town's long gone now, but people say weird things happen around here. People have disappeared, they never found bodies, just gone." Emma rolled her eyes. "Every forest has a people disappearing story." Tom shrugged, clearly enjoying himself. "Maybe, but they say something still walks in these woods. Something that can make you forget." There was a moment of silence before Lily burst out laughing. "I'm sorry, Tom, but that's ridiculous." The conversation moved on, but the eerie tone lingered. Eventually, one by one, we all turned in for the night. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the forest settled into its nighttime rhythm. I fell asleep to the sound of crickets and the soft crackle of dying flames. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. Sometime during the night I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. Maybe a sound or a change in the air. But something felt wrong. The tent was stuffy, and the darkness felt thick, oppressive. Emma was asleep beside me, her breathing steady. I listened. The crickets were gone. The forest had gone silent, as if holding its breath. I held mine too, straining to hear anything at all. Then, faintly, a whisper, soft, barely audible, like wind through leaves. But it wasn't the wind. I could hear words, though I couldn't make them out. They were wrong, distorted somehow. I slowly unzipped the tent and peered out. The fire was out, nothing but cold ashes and smoke. The trees loomed like shadows against the night sky. And there, just at the edge of the clearing, I saw something, a figure. At first, I thought it was one of the others, maybe Tom or Jason. But this figure wasn't moving. It was just standing there, at the edge of the darkness, as if waiting for something. My heart thudded in my chest, and I blinked, trying to clear my vision. The figure didn't move, but I had the growing, horrible sensation that it was staring right at me. I whispered Emma's name, but she didn't wake up. I whispered louder, shaking her shoulder. Still nothing. I glanced back at the figure. It was gone. I froze. My heart pounded in my ears. I scanned the edge of the clearing, but it was empty. The whispering had stopped too. The silence was deafening. Telling myself it had just been a trick of the light, I lay back down, pulling the sleeping bag up to my chin. Sleep didn't come easily, but eventually, exhaustion overtook me. The next morning I didn't mention what I'd seen. Maybe it was a dream. That's what I told myself. But Tom was acting strange. He was usually the first one up, eager to make breakfast or start packing for the day. But this morning he sat by the dead fire, staring at the ashes, barely acknowledging anyone. "Hey, you all right?" Jason asked, slapping Tom on the back. Tom blinked as if he hadn't heard the question. He muttered something about a rough night and shook it off, but I could tell something had rattled him. The hike that day felt off. The woods were darker than they had been before, even though the sun was out. The trees felt too close, the air too still, and every so often I thought I caught glimpses of something moving just out of sight, flitting between the trunks, but whenever I turned, there was nothing. Then, late in the afternoon, we came across something that stopped us all cold. A cabin. It shouldn't have been there. There were no markings on the map, no trails leading to it. The wood was rotting. The roof partially collapsed, but it was unmistakable. A relic from the logging town Tom had mentioned the night before. No one spoke. We just stared. Finally, Tom broke the silence. "We should check it out." "No way," Emma said immediately, shaking her head. "This place gives me the creeps." But Tom was already walking toward it, his face set in that stubborn way of his. Jason and Lily followed, reluctant but curious. Emma and I exchanged a glance before we trailed behind them. The door was ajar, hanging on rusted hinges. Inside, it was exactly what you'd expect from an abandoned cabin. Dust, broken furniture, and the stench of mold. But there was something else, too. A feeling, like the air was heavier, thicker, as if we had walked into something ancient. Something that didn't want us there. Tom stepped inside first, his boots creaking on the wooden floor. The rest of us stayed near the entrance, watching him carefully. He turned toward a wall where something was scratched into the wood. I saw his eyes narrow, trying to make sense of it. "What is it?" Jason asked, stepping closer. Tom didn't answer. He just kept staring, his mouth slightly open, his eyes unfocused. I moved closer, squinting at the marks. They weren't random scratches. They were words, carved deep into the wood in jagged, uneven lines. I read them aloud, my voice barely a whisper. "Do not forget." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Do not forget. What did that mean? And then, as if on cue, Tom slowly turned toward us, his face pale and blank. His lips moved, and when he spoke, it was barely audible. "I don't remember." My blood ran cold. "What?" Tom blinked, his face twisting in confusion. "Where are we?" "Tom, we're camping, man," Jason said, his voice rising in concern. But Tom only looked more confused. He stepped back from the wall, his eyes darting around the cabin like he was seeing it for the first time. "I don't remember this place," he whispered. "How did we get here?" The air in the cabin felt suffocating now. I grabbed Emma's hand and pulled her toward the door. "We need to go." As we hurried out, I glanced back at Tom. He was still standing there, staring at the scratched words, a lost expression on his face. That night, as we sat around the campfire, Tom didn't say a word. He just stared into the flames, a hollow look in his eyes. And I couldn't help but wonder, what had Tom forgotten? And more terrifyingly, what might we all forget before the weekend was over? I never believed in ghost stories, not really. They were the kind of things you laugh about around a campfire, but never take seriously. Until that night. Until the night something happened that I can't explain. It started as a regular camping trip, just me and my best friend, Derek. We'd been planning it for weeks, a long weekend in the woods, away from everything, just two guys with a couple of tents and enough beer to last until Monday. The campsite we picked was pretty far out, down a dirt road that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. No other campers, no cabins, no signs of civilization for miles. Perfect, we thought. The day went by uneventfully. We set up our tents, gathered some wood, and by the time the sun started setting, we had a fire going. The air was cool, the woods were quiet, almost too quiet. But I figured that was just the remoteness of the place. I mean, we wanted to be alone, right? As the sky darkened, we sat around the fire, drinking and swapping stories. Most of them were the usual stuff. Dumb things we did in high school, work stress, bad relationships. The fire crackled, the trees swayed in the breeze, and I felt good, relaxed, until Derek brought up the subject of local legends. "You ever heard of the Watcher of the Pines?" he asked, half smiling, as if daring me to call him out on a stupid prank. I shook my head. "What's that, another Bigfoot story?" "No, man, way creepier." He took a sip of his beer, his eyes flicking toward the darkness just beyond the firelight. "It's like, I don't know, like a local thing. People say there's something in these woods, something that watches you, but you can't see it. Not until it's too late." I laughed, but there was something in Derek's voice that made me uneasy. "Come on, man, you're not seriously buying into that crap, are you?" I didn't, not until my cousin went missing out here a few years back. He tossed his empty can into the fire, the flames flaring up for a moment. He was camping just like us. Said he kept hearing things at night, like someone walking around his tent, but every time he checked, there was no one there. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I shrugged it off. "So, what happened?" Derek stared into the fire for a moment, his expression darkening. "They never found him. Just his tent. It was ripped open, like something had dragged him out." For a while, we sat there in silence, the fire crackling and popping between us. I didn't want to admit it, but the story got under my skin. There was something about the way Derek told it, the way the forest seemed to listen, that made the air feel colder. Eventually, we called it a night. Derek was asleep within minutes of hitting his sleeping bag, but I lay awake, staring up at the nylon ceiling of my tent, listening to the sounds outside, or rather the lack of sounds. There were no crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant animal calls, just dead silence. The kind of silence that presses in on you, makes you hyper-aware of every tiny noise. I closed my eyes, trying to calm myself, telling myself it was all in my head. But then I heard it. Footsteps. Soft, shuffling footsteps coming from the edge of the campsite. My eyes snapped open and my heart began to race. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. Someone, or something, was moving around out there. I sat up slowly, careful not to make any noise, and reached for the flashlight by my side. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, listening, waiting. Then, they started again, closer this time. I clicked on the flashlight and pointed it toward Derek's tent. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the thin fabric of his tent, lit up like a ghostly white dome. No movement, no shadow. I swept the light around the campsite, my hand trembling. The fire had burned down to embers, casting weak, flickering light. The trees stood like dark sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. Everything looked normal, too normal. I was about to call out to Derek when the footsteps stopped again, right on the edge of the light. My heart pounded in my chest, the air thick with tension. I could feel eyes on me, like something was standing just beyond my reach, watching, waiting. Suddenly there was a rustling sound, quick and sharp, like something moving fast through the brush. My flashlight beam jerked in the direction of the noise, but there was nothing there. Just the empty woods, stretching into darkness. Then I heard the zipper of Derek's tent. "Derek?" I whispered, my voice shaky. No response. The zipper sound came again, this time slower, like it was being pulled open from the inside. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and took a step toward his tent. "Derek, are you messing with me, man? This isn't funny." Still nothing. The zipper finished its slow slide down, and the flap of his tent hung open, dark and still. I was about to shine the light inside when Derek's voice came from behind me. "What's going on?" I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my hand. Derek stood there, bleary-eyed, emerging from the trees, a confused look on his face. "I had to take a piss. Why the hell are you standing by my tent?" I looked back at his tent, the flap still open, and my blood ran cold. I thought you were inside." Derek frowned. "No, man. I was over there." He pointed toward the woods, the spot where he must have wandered off to relieve himself. Slowly, I turned the flashlight back to the tent. There was no movement, no sound, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been inside it. Something had unzipped it. We didn't say much after that. Derek saw the look on my face and knew something was wrong, but he didn't push. We both crawled into our tents, but I didn't sleep. Not really. Every little noise, every gust of wind, felt like something was creeping closer. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, it was dawn. Pale light filtered through the trees, and the campsite looked normal again. Quiet. Peaceful, even. Derek was already up, packing his things. "Let's get the hell out of here," he said, not meeting my eyes. I didn't argue. We packed up in record time, and within an hour we were on the road, the campsite shrinking into the distance behind us. But as we drove, Derek broke the silence. "You saw it, didn't you?" I glanced at him, my throat tight. "Saw what?" "The Watcher," he said quietly. "I saw it too. Last night, just before I went into the woods." My skin crawled. "What did you see?" He hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "It was tall, dark, just standing there by the trees. I thought it was just a shadow at first, but then it moved." I didn't say anything, but my mind raced back to the footsteps, the unzipped tent, the feeling of being watched. "I think it followed us," Derek said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to believe him. I wanted to tell myself it was all in our heads, that we were just spooked from being out in the woods. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching me. The fire crackled softly as I poked at it with a long stick, watching the embers shift beneath the logs. It was just me, alone in the middle of a remote campground deep in the woods. I had driven up here to escape the noise of the city for the weekend, a break from the ceaseless hum of life. I'd found the campground online. It seemed perfect, isolated, tucked away from the main trails, and barely visited. I wanted solitude, but now, sitting in the eerie silence of the forest, I wasn't so sure. The trees towered around me, dark shadows against the dying light of dusk. I could barely make out the outline of the trail that led back to where my car was parked, a good mile away. I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived that morning. As the night fell, the forest felt like it was closing in. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, and somewhere far off, an owl hooted. I chuckled to myself, trying to shake off the nervous energy building in my chest. It's just your imagination, I thought. Being alone does strange things to the mind. After eating a quick dinner and feeding the fire some fresh wood, I settled into my tent for the night. The only sounds now were the crackling of the fire and the occasional whisper of the wind. For a while, I lay there staring up at the nylon roof of the tent, listening to the sounds of the woods, my thoughts drifting. But then I heard it, a sharp snap, a branch breaking maybe 50 yards away. My heart thudded in my chest, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I strained my ears, waiting, holding my breath. Nothing, just the wind. I shook my head. Probably a deer, maybe a raccoon. I was in the middle of a forest after all. I settled back down, telling myself to stop being ridiculous, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave me. There was something off about this place, something that hadn't felt right since I first arrived. The kind of silence that isn't natural, the feeling that the trees themselves were watching. I pushed the thought away and closed my eyes. Another snap, closer this time. My eyes flew open and I listened, every nerve on edge. The sound was unmistakable, footsteps, deliberate, moving through the underbrush toward my campsite. I sat up, fumbling for my flashlight, my pulse hammering in my ears. I clicked it on and shone the beam through the mesh of the tent. The fire outside flickered dimly, casting long shadows over the trees. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding weak in the silence. "Is someone there?" No answer. The footsteps stopped. I swallowed hard and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cold night air. The fire had died down, its warmth barely reaching me. I scanned the darkness, shining the beam of my flashlight over the trees, the bushes, the trail. Nothing. No sign of anyone or anything. I stood there for a long time, my breath clouding in front of me. Every muscle tensed. But after a while, the woods fell silent again, save for the wind. Maybe it was an animal, maybe it wasn't. I threw a few more logs onto the fire, watching as the flames leapt back to life, casting their light around the campsite. I told myself I was overreacting, letting the isolation get to me. Still, I stayed outside for a while, keeping an eye on the trees, waiting for the sound to return. It didn't. Eventually, I crawled back into the tent, leaving the fire burning brighter this time. I lay there, heart still pounding, but exhaustion was beginning to win out over fear. My eyelids grew heavy, and I started to drift. Then the whispering started. At first, I thought it was the wind again, but this was different. Soft, hushed voices, just outside the tent. Too low to make out, but unmistakably there, circling my campsite. My breath caught in my throat as I listened, frozen in place. The voices weren't human, or if they were, they weren't speaking any language I recognized. It was a strange, garbled whisper, like something from a dream. I didn't move. I couldn't move. Then the footsteps started again, slow and deliberate, moving closer and closer to the tent. My flashlight was still in my hand, but I didn't dare turn it on this time. Somehow I knew I didn't want to see whatever was out there. The footsteps circled around me, and the whispering grew louder, more insistent. The air inside the tent felt thick, suffocating. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for it to stop, for the night to end, for anything to make this nightmare go away. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the voices and footsteps stopped. Silence. I stayed there, rigid, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. No more footsteps, no more whispers, just the crackling of the fire outside. It was hours before I dared move. When I finally did, I crawled out of the tent again, flashlight in hand. The air felt different now, colder, heavier. The trees loomed darker than before, like they were hiding something just beyond the reach of the light. That's when I saw it. Something was carved into the trunk of the tree just behind my tent. Symbols. Strange, twisting symbols that hadn't been there before. My stomach dropped as I traced the lines with my eyes, my skin crawling. Suddenly the whispering came back, louder this time, closer. I spun around, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand, but there was no one there. I knew in that moment I had to leave. I didn't care if it was the middle of the night. I didn't care about packing up the tent. I had to get out of there. But as I turned toward the trail, I froze. Standing there just at the edge of the light was a figure. Dark, shadowed, its features impossible to make out. But I could feel it staring at me, watching. And then I realized something that made my blood run cold. The figure wasn't standing in the light. It was part of the shadows. It wasn't something separate from the darkness. It was the darkness. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight, heart racing. The thing didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, waiting. And then, without warning, it stepped back into the trees and disappeared. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car, threw open the door, and sped down the dirt road, not looking back once. When I finally got home, I collapsed onto my couch, still shaking, my mind racing. I kept telling myself it was just a trick of the light, just my imagination. But then I remembered the symbols on the tree, the whispers. And then, as I reached into my pocket, I pulled out my phone. I hadn't realized I had taken a picture of the campsite earlier that evening, before everything went wrong. My heart stopped as I looked at the image. There, in the background of the photo, barely visible in the fading light, was the figure, standing between the trees. It had been watching me the whole time. Camping had always been my go-to escape. The solitude, the break from the constant noise of the city, it was like hitting a reset button. But after what happened last summer, I don't think I'll ever step foot in the woods again. It started like any other trip. I decided to head out alone this time, just me, my gear, and the endless stretch of forest. I drove up into the mountains, taking a narrow, winding road that I'd found on a map. It led to a place that, as far as I could tell, no one else ever went. I liked that idea. No crowds, no other campers, just nature. By the time I parked the car at the trailhead, the sun was beginning to set behind the tree line, casting everything in a warm, golden light. I should have felt calm, but the moment I stepped out of the car, an uneasy feeling crept up my spine. I brushed it off, probably just nerves from being out there alone. I'd been camping solo plenty of times, but this place, it felt different, quieter, too quiet. I grabbed my pack and started hiking, following the narrow trail deeper into the woods. The path twisted and turned through dense trees, their branches thick with pine needles, blocking out most of the remaining daylight. After an hour or so, I reached a small clearing and decided it would be a good spot to set up camp. The sun was dipping lower, and I didn't want to be fumbling with my tent in the dark. As I worked, that uneasy feeling never really went away. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced that something was watching me from the tree line. But every time I looked, there was nothing, just shadows and trees. By the time the fire was crackling, the stars had come out. The woods were still eerily silent. No animals, no wind, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of a tree swaying in the breeze. I tried to relax, telling myself I was just overthinking things, but deep down I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. Then I heard it, a faint rustling in the bushes behind me. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. Slowly I turned, expecting to see a deer or some small animal. But there was nothing, just darkness. The fire cast long, flickering shadows, but beyond its reach, the forest was pitch black. I stood there, staring into the trees, straining to hear the noise again. Silence. I shook my head, chuckling nervously. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, settling back down by the fire. But before I could relax, I heard it again. Rustle, crack. This time the sound was louder, closer. I jumped to my feet, shining my flashlight into the woods, but the beam only pierced a few feet into the dense underbrush. I took a deep breath and called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. I slowly circled the camp, flashlight in hand, sweeping the beam through the trees. But there was nothing. No movement, no sign of anyone or anything. My skin crawled, every instinct screaming that I was being watched, but I had no proof. No eyes reflecting back at me from the shadows, no footsteps, just that unnerving sound. Finally, I forced myself to sit back down by the fire, telling myself it was probably just an animal that had already scurried off. Maybe a raccoon or something. But even as I sat there staring into the flames, I felt eyes on me. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I would hear something, twigs snapping, leaves crunching. Every time I'd sit up, flashlight in hand, only to find nothing. By the time the sky started to lighten, I was exhausted. But at least the daylight brought some relief. I decided to stay another night, though every instinct told me I should leave. I had come all this way, and I wasn't going to let a few creepy noises scare me off. I spent the day hiking, trying to put some distance between myself and the unease that had settled over me. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, the sunlight filtering through the trees in golden rays. For a while I almost managed to forget the previous night, but as the sun started to set again, the feeling returned. That suffocating sense of being watched. This time I couldn't brush it off. When I got back to camp, everything felt wrong. The clearing was exactly as I'd left it, but it felt different, like the trees were closing in, watching. I tried to shake off the feeling, but as night fell, the silence grew oppressive. Not even the crackling of the fire could drown it out. I sat there staring into the flames, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. But then I heard it again, that rustling in the bushes. But this time, it didn't stop. The sound grew louder, moving closer until it was just beyond the edge of the firelight. My heart raced as I stood up, gripping the flashlight. I pointed it toward the sound, and my breath caught in my throat. There, standing just outside the reach of the light, was a figure. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long, gangly limbs that seemed to stretch impossibly far. Its body was dark, almost blending into the trees behind it, but I could make out the faint outline of its form. And the eyes, those were the worst part. Two glowing orbs reflecting back at me, like a predator's eyes in the night. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare, paralyzed with fear, as the thing stood there, watching me. Then slowly it began to move. It didn't walk. It glided, like its feet never touched the ground. It circled the camp, staying just beyond the light, its eyes never leaving me. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed toward the fire, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. Run? Stay? Could I even outrun it? Before I could make a decision, the thing stopped. It stood there perfectly still, watching me for what felt like hours, and then, without warning, it melted back into the trees, disappearing as silently as it had appeared. I didn't wait. I grabbed my gear, threw it into my pack, and ran. I didn't care about the dark. I didn't care about the narrow trail. I just needed to get out of there. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I expected to see it, but the woods behind me were empty. By the time I reached my car, the sun was starting to rise. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I jumped in, started the engine, and tore down that dirt road as fast as I could. I don't know what I saw that night. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me after a sleepless night. But deep down, I know it was real. Something was out there, something that was watching me. And the worst part, sometimes late at night when I'm lying in bed and the world is quiet, I swear I can still feel those eyes, watching, waiting. Camping has always been a refuge for me, somewhere to escape the noise and chaos of the city. But after what happened last summer, I'm not sure I'll ever set foot in the woods again. I had planned a weekend trip with 3 friends, Sarah, Jake, and Luke. We'd found this remote campsite, miles away from the nearest town, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains. No cell service, no roads for miles. Just us, the wilderness, and the stars. The drive was long, but when we finally arrived, the view was breathtaking. Towering trees surrounded us, their thick branches almost blocking out the sky. The air was cool and fresh, with the scent of pine and damp earth. We set up camp beside a wide clearing, a perfect spot for a fire, with just enough open space for us to lie back and stargaze. The first night was uneventful. We shared some laughs around the fire, told the usual ghost stories, and eventually drifted off to sleep in our tents. It wasn't until the second night that things took a turn. It started with the wind. A sudden sharp gust swept through the clearing, almost strong enough to put out the fire. The trees groaned under its weight, their branches creaking like old wood, and the temperature dropped fast. At first we thought it was just a storm rolling in, but the sky was clear, not a cloud in sight. And the wind, it wasn't natural. It came in bursts, starting and stopping, almost like it was breathing. Jake was the first to notice something strange. "Do you hear that?" he asked, cocking his head to one side. We all fell silent, straining our ears. There was something just barely audible over the wind, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on wood. It seemed to be coming from deep in the woods, but it echoed in a way that made it hard to tell how far. We exchanged uneasy glances, but none of us wanted to admit we were spooked. "Probably just a branch knocking against a tree," Luke said, though he didn't sound convinced. The tapping continued, growing louder as the night wore on, and soon it was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just random knocks anymore. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate, like footsteps. Sarah shivered. "I don't like this," she said. "It's too quiet." She was right. Aside from the wind and the tapping, the forest was dead silent. No crickets, no rustling of animals in the underbrush. Nothing. It was as if everything in the forest had gone still, waiting. We tried to brush it off, sitting closer to the fire, but the unease crept in like a shadow. That's when Sarah noticed something in the trees. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing toward the tree line. We all turned, squinting into the darkness beyond the firelight. At first I didn't see anything, but then, just for a moment, I caught a glimpse of something moving between the trees. It was tall, too tall to be a person, and its movements were wrong, jerky, unnatural, like it didn't quite understand how to move through the forest. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light, the flickering flames playing with my eyes, but then I saw it again. And this time so did everyone else. "Who the hell is that?" Jake muttered, standing up, his eyes locked on the figure. We all stood, tense, as the figure moved closer to the edge of the clearing. It didn't come into the light, but it stayed just out of reach, pacing back and forth, like it was watching us. Luke grabbed the flashlight from his pack and shone it toward the trees, but as soon as the beam hit the figure, it was gone. Vanished, like it had never been there. The woods fell silent again. The wind stopped, and for a moment all we could hear was the crackling of the fire and our own ragged breathing. "We need to go," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. We all agreed. We packed up quickly, stuffing our gear into our packs as fast as we could. But just as we were about to extinguish the fire, we heard it, the sound that still haunts me to this day. A voice, faint but clear. It came from the woods, from the exact spot where the figure had disappeared. And it was calling our names. Not just any names. Our names. One by one, in that same eerie, breathy tone, it whispered each of us over and over again. Sarah's face went pale, and Luke dropped his flashlight, his hands trembling. No one moved. We just stood there, paralyzed by the sound. Then the voice changed. It stopped calling our names and began to mimic us. It was repeating things we had said earlier around the campfire, in the exact tone and cadence. Little jokes, offhand comments, things only we would know. It was like it was trying to lure us into the woods, to draw us away from the fire. Suddenly Jake broke the silence. "We need to leave now." Without another word, we grabbed our gear and bolted for the car, stumbling through the dark woods, the voice still calling after us, still repeating our words. I don't know how we made it back to the car without getting lost, but by the time we reached it, the voice had faded into the distance. We didn't speak on the drive home, we just sat there in silence, too shaken to process what had happened. But as we pulled onto the main road, Sarah broke down, sobbing. "I don't think it's over," she said through her tears. I didn't understand what she meant until I got home. Later that night, as I lay in bed, trying to shake off the unease of the trip, I heard it again. My name. It was soft, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. It came from the corner of the room, from the shadows. I sat up, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. And then I heard it again. This time it was laughing. I never told the others. But I know, deep down, that whatever was in those woods that night, it followed us home. And every once in a while, in the dead of night, I still hear it, calling my name. I've always been drawn to solitude. There's something about the silence, the untouched wilderness, and the idea of being completely alone that clears my mind. That's why I decided to go camping by myself. No distractions, no company. Just me and the wilderness. I found the perfect spot deep in the woods, miles from any trail or road. It was late fall, and most of the campgrounds were empty. Exactly what I wanted. I set up my tent near a small, placid lake, surrounded by towering pines and thick underbrush. The only sounds were the occasional gust of wind and the gentle ripple of water against the shore. It was peaceful, quiet, perfect. I spent the day fishing, reading, and just enjoying the stillness. By the time the sun began to set, casting an orange glow across the lake, I had started a small fire. As the evening darkened, I stared up at the stars, feeling that strange sense of insignificance that only the wilderness can give you. Out here, I wasn't important. I was just another living thing in a vast, indifferent world. But as the fire crackled and the night settled in, that feeling of peace started to shift. The forest was too quiet, not just peaceful quiet, but unnaturally silent. There were no animals, no wind, no rustling of leaves, just the sound of my own breathing and the occasional pop of the firewood. The kind of quiet that makes you feel watched. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But something was off. I felt a creeping sensation in my gut that told me I wasn't as alone as I thought. I stood up, scanning the tree line with my flashlight. The beam barely penetrated the thick wall of darkness beyond my campsite. Shadows danced between the trees, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I sat back down by the fire, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. I forced myself to focus on the crackling flames, to let the warmth soothe me. But the feeling of unease only grew. Every few minutes I'd glance over my shoulder, convinced I'd see someone, or something, lurking just beyond the light. Then I heard it, a soft rustling sound from the woods behind me. I froze, straining to listen. It was faint but unmistakable, something moving through the underbrush. My heart started racing, and I slowly reached for my flashlight again, shining it into the trees. Nothing, just the beam reflecting off the dense forest floor. But the sound was real, I was sure of it. I stood up, moving slowly towards the edge of the campsite, my ears tuned to every tiny noise. And then it stopped. The rustling, the movement, it was gone. The silence returned, heavier than before. I backed up towards the fire, keeping the flashlight trained on the tree line, and then I heard it again, this time from the opposite side of the campsite. Another faint rustle. Something, or someone, was circling me. I turned quickly, shining the light in the direction of the noise. Nothing again. My pulse was pounding in my ears now, my skin crawling. This wasn't some animal. Animals don't move like that. Silent, deliberate, watching. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but it was pitch black and I wasn't about to trek through the woods in the middle of the night. I decided to stoke the fire, keep it blazing high. It made me feel a little safer, like the light would keep whatever was out there at bay. But the unease didn't go away. It clung to me, a constant pressure at the back of my mind. That's when I saw it. Just beyond the firelight, where the shadows started to swallow the trees, there was a shape, a figure. It was tall, too tall to be human, but hunched, its outline barely visible in the flickering glow of the flames. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but it was still there, motionless, watching. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. I couldn't make out any details, no face, no features, just the vague, horrifying silhouette standing just beyond the light. I wanted to call out, to ask who it was, but my voice caught in my throat. My legs felt like they were locked in place, my brain screaming at me to run, to do anything. But I just stood there, paralyzed with fear. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure moved, quickly, silently, back into the darkness. Gone. I backed up until I was almost inside the fire, every nerve in my body screaming to get out, to leave. I grabbed my sleeping bag and flashlight and retreated into the tent, zipping it up as fast as I could, even though I knew it wouldn't protect me from whatever was out there. Inside the tent, I sat with my back to the wall, flashlight clutched in my hand. My heart pounded, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Hours passed. Every small sound outside made me jump. I kept telling myself I was imagining things, that the isolation was messing with my head. But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember is waking up to a scratching sound. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more persistent. Something was scraping against the fabric of my tent. Slow, deliberate scratches, like nails dragging across the nylon. I froze, my body stiff with terror. The scraping moved around the tent, circling, methodical, like it was testing the boundaries, waiting for me to make a move. Then I heard a soft whisper, barely audible, like wind through the trees, but wrong. I couldn't make out the words, but the voice was low, guttural, and filled with malice. The scratching stopped. For what felt like hours, I sat there, barely breathing, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, the sun began to rise, and the first light of dawn filtered through the tent fabric. I didn't wait for anything else. I packed up as fast as I could and hiked out of there, never looking back. I don't know what was out there that night. I don't want to know, but I haven't been camping alone since. Whatever it wasn't human. And it was watching me. We had planned this trip for months. It was supposed to be a weekend of hiking, camping, and unwinding in the middle of nowhere. Just the four of us, me, my girlfriend Claire, and our friends Nate and Sophie. We were all craving an escape from the noise of the city, so we picked a remote spot in the woods by Cold Creek. The name sounded peaceful enough, right? Just a quiet little creek tucked away in the forest. But when we told the owner of the cabin where we parked the car that we'd be camping there, his face went a bit pale. "You be careful out there," he said. "Strange things happen near that creek." I remember laughing, thinking it was just some local trying to spook tourists. We were seasoned campers after all. We'd done this 100 times before. Nate joked about bringing a silver bullet and garlic, just in case. We didn't take him seriously. None of us did. We hiked deep into the woods that first day, farther than we'd planned. But the scenery was worth it. Massive trees towered over us, their branches creating a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. We followed the creek until we found the perfect clearing to set up camp. The creek water was cold and clear, and the only sound was the gentle rush of it flowing over the rocks. By the time night fell, we were exhausted but content. We lit a fire, cooked some food, and sat around telling stories. The stars were out, brighter than we'd ever seen them, and the only thing that seemed out of place was the thick fog that rolled in just after sunset, creeping in off the creek like a living thing. It hung low, swirling through the trees, but none of us were too bothered by it. It gave the night an eerie, mysterious vibe, which Nate leaned into by telling us a story he'd heard about Cold Creek. "You know this place has a history, right?" he started, flashing a grin at me and Claire. "Back in the 1800s, they say there was a village nearby. People settled here to farm and raise their families. But one year there was a brutal winter, the kind that starves a town, crops failed, food ran out. The story goes that they turned to, well, desperate measures." Sophie, who had been listening intently, narrowed her eyes. "Desperate measures? Like what?" Nate's grin faded. "Cannibalism." Claire groaned and tossed a marshmallow at him. "Seriously? That's the best you've got?" Nate shrugged. "I'm just saying there are legends about this place. They say you can still hear the cries of the lost villagers wandering the woods, hungry for something more." We all laughed it off, though there was a part of me that found it unsettling, especially with the fog thickening around us, creeping closer to our little circle of firelight. But eventually, we brushed it off as another spooky campfire story and turned in for the night. I woke up a few hours later. At first, I didn't know why. Everything was still, quiet, except for the soft rustling of the leaves. The fire had long since died down, and our tent was filled with the pale light of the moon filtering through the fog. I lay there listening, but something felt off. It was too quiet. No crickets, no wind, just an oppressive silence. And then I heard it, a faint splash like something or someone wading through the creek. At first I thought it was Nate or Sophie getting up to relieve themselves, but then I realized it was coming from further downstream, in the direction of the thickest part of the fog. The sound was slow, deliberate, like something was dragging itself through the water. I nudged Claire. "Do you hear that?" She groaned softly and sat up, listening. Her eyes widened as the splashing grew louder, now accompanied by a low, wet, gurgling sound, like someone trying to speak through water. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know." I reached for my flashlight, heart pounding in my chest, and unzipped the tent. Cold air rushed in, making me shiver, though it wasn't from the temperature. I shone the beam of light toward the creek, but the fog was so thick it swallowed the light almost immediately. The splashing stopped. For a few seconds, everything was still again. Claire and I exchanged a nervous glance, her hand gripping my arm. Then, out of nowhere, a loud crack echoed through the woods like a branch snapping under the weight of something heavy. We both jumped, and in the tent next to ours I heard Nate curse under his breath. "What the hell was that?" he called out, his voice muffled by the fabric of his tent. "I don't know," I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Stay inside for now." Then we heard something else, a soft rhythmic sound almost like crying. It was faint, barely audible but unmistakable. It came from the direction of the creek, floating toward us on the fog. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Claire whispered, That's a child." I shook my head, trying to make sense of it. "There's no way. There's no one out here." But the sound persisted, growing louder, closer, as if the child was moving toward us. It was a soft, pitiful wail, and underneath it was something else. A strange, distorted whispering, like multiple voices speaking in unison. It felt wrong, like the air was being sucked out of the forest. I grabbed a rock from the fire pit and hurled it in the direction of the creek. "Who's out there?" I shouted, my voice shaky. "Show yourself." Nothing but silence. The crying had stopped, and now there was only the fog swirling unnaturally thick around us. Suddenly Sophie screamed. I whipped around to see her stumbling out of the tent, her face pale as death. "Nate's gone," she yelled. "He's gone." Claire and I rushed over. Sophie was shaking, pointing at the empty space where Nate had been sleeping. His sleeping bag was still zipped up, but he was gone, like he'd just disappeared without a trace. "There's no way he just left," Claire said, her voice trembling. It was supposed to be a perfect weekend, a chance to escape the city, breathe some fresh air, and get lost in the wilderness. I hadn't been camping in years, and when my buddy Tom suggested we head out to Lake Orenda, I jumped at the chance. It was a secluded spot, about an hour's hike from the nearest road, surrounded by dense forest. The kind of place where you could forget the rest of the world existed. We arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The lake was pristine, the water so still it looked like glass, reflecting the towering pines that lined its edge. We set up camp near the shore, close enough to hear the gentle lapping of the water, but far enough from the thick woods that we felt exposed to the open sky. The first few hours were peaceful. We got a fire going, cooked up some food, and settled into our folding chairs, watching the last light fade from the horizon. The air was cool but comfortable, and the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the occasional splash from the lake. As night fell, though, something about the place started to feel off. The air got heavier, and the forest around us seemed unnaturally quiet. It wasn't just that the usual nighttime sounds of insects and distant animal calls had faded. It was like the entire forest was holding its breath. Tom noticed it too. "You hear that?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. I nodded, feeling a tightness in my chest I couldn't quite explain. "Yeah, it's too quiet." We sat there in uneasy silence, listening. Every now and then I thought I could hear something just beyond the reach of the firelight, like soft footsteps moving through the brush. But when I shone my flashlight into the woods, there was nothing. Only the endless rows of trees standing motionless in the dark. "Probably just animals," Tom said, trying to sound casual, but I could see the unease in his eyes. He wasn't convinced, and neither was I. We tried to shake it off, but the quiet was suffocating. We talked in low voices, telling ourselves we were overthinking it, but the feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore. It was like something was out there, just beyond our vision, lurking in the dark, waiting. Then came the smell. It hit us both at the same time, a sour, metallic stench that hung in the air like rotten meat. I gagged, covering my nose, and Tom cursed under his breath. It was overwhelming, like something had died and was left to rot for days. But the strangest thing was that it came out of nowhere. One moment the air was clean and fresh, and the next it was thick with decay. We stood up, both of us scanning the tree line, but again, nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the stench clinging to the air like it was taunting us. I reached for my flashlight, my hand shaking as I clicked it on and swept the beam through the trees. That's when I saw it. At first it was just a glimpse, a flash of white between the trees, low to the ground. It was quick, too quick for me to focus on, but it was there. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Did you see that?" I whispered, barely able to get the words out. Tom was already standing beside me, gripping his own flashlight. "Yeah," he muttered. "What the hell was that?" We both stood there, staring into the darkness, waiting for it to appear again. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, just as I started to relax, it came back. This time it was closer. I couldn't make out details, but it was low to the ground, hunched and moving in a way that made my skin crawl, like it didn't have control over its limbs. The smell grew stronger, so thick I could taste it, and I realized with a cold shock that it was coming from whatever that thing was. We both stepped back, instinctively moving closer to the fire. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what it could be. A bear? Some kind of animal that was injured or sick? But deep down, I knew it wasn't an animal. The way it moved wasn't natural. "Let's get the hell out of here," Tom whispered, his voice barely steady. I nodded, not needing to be told twice. We started packing up our gear as quickly and quietly as possible, but the whole time I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was watching us. It hadn't made a sound, no rustling of leaves, no breaking of branches, just the overwhelming sense of something lurking. As we packed up, the smell faded, and the woods returned to their eerie silence. For a brief moment, I thought maybe it had gone. that we had scared it off. But just as I started to breathe easier, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a voice. Faint, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. It came from the edge of the woods where I had seen the thing moving. The voice was soft, like it was trying to coax us closer. It called out to us, both of us, using our names. Tom, come here. Ryan, don't leave. I froze, staring at Tom. His face had gone pale, his eyes wide with fear. We need to go. Now. We grabbed our remaining gear and bolted, leaving the fire burning as we stumbled down the trail toward the car. The voice followed us, still whispering, still calling, growing fainter the farther we ran. When we finally reached the car, we threw our gear into the back and peeled out of there, not looking back. We drove in silence, the weight of what we had just experienced pressing down on us like a heavy fog. I haven't been back to Lake Orenda since, neither has Tom, but sometimes late at night I'll hear something outside my window, a faint voice calling my name, soft and inviting, and every time it smells like rot. I've always been a bit of an outdoors enthusiast. There's something about getting away from the noise of daily life, from people and technology, that brings me peace. That's why I decided to take a solo trip out to Silent Lake, a place deep in the wilderness that I had heard about only from whispers among fellow campers. A hidden gem, they called it. No marked trails, no phone signal, and no one around for miles. Perfect. The hike to the lake was longer than I expected. I set out early in the morning, but it wasn't until late afternoon that I caught the first glimpse of the water through the thick trees. The lake lived up to its name. Still and silent, the water was smooth as glass, reflecting the sky above like a mirror. Not a ripple, not a breeze. It was unnerving, but beautiful in its own way. I set up camp on the shore just a few feet from the water's edge. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the only sound came from the occasional chirp of birds and the soft crackle of my campfire. The lake was so quiet it almost felt oppressive, like the whole place was holding its breath. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the silence deepened. I ate a quick dinner, and as night closed in, I felt a creeping unease settle in my bones. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe I wasn't used to this level of isolation, but something about the stillness felt wrong. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. There were no stars. The sky above was clear, a dark velvet curtain, but no stars blinked through it. The moon should have been out too, but it was nowhere to be seen. The lake reflected nothing but blackness. I stared up, confused, feeling the oddest sensation that I was being watched. It was a ridiculous thought, of course. There was no one else for miles. But I couldn't shake it. That night I barely slept. The air was too still, the quiet too heavy. I kept hearing small sounds, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig. But every time I looked around, there was nothing. Just the same still dead lake. I woke early the next morning, hoping that the daylight would chase away the uneasy feeling that had taken root in my gut. But the moment I unzipped my tent, I froze. Footprints. All around my tent, circling it in wide, uneven arcs, were footprints. Bare feet, pressed deep into the soil, leading from the forest to the edge of the lake and back again. They weren't mine. I had worn hiking boots all day, and these were fresh, like someone had been walking around my camp while I slept. I stood there for a moment, staring at the lake. Its surface was just as smooth as the day before. No sign of anyone or anything near it. I wanted to believe it was some weird prank, that maybe I had stumbled into some other camper's territory without realizing it. But the longer I looked at the footprints, the less human they seemed. The toes were too long, the arch too high, the shape slightly off. I packed up my things quickly, deciding to leave as soon as possible. But as I stuffed my tent into my backpack, I glanced back at the lake, and I swear something was standing there. Not at the edge, but in the middle of the water. It was just a shadow at first, an indistinct figure barely visible through the early morning mist. It didn't move, didn't splash. It was just there, standing on the water like it belonged. I blinked, and it was gone. I didn't think twice. I grabbed my gear and started back up the trail, desperate to get away from that strange, suffocating silence. The hike back felt slower somehow. Every few steps, I had the unsettling sense that the path was longer than before, stretching out unnaturally in front of me. The trees loomed closer, their branches clawing at me like bony fingers. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I half expected to see something lurking just behind me, watching, waiting. About halfway back to my car, I realized something even more disturbing. The forest had gone silent too. The birds, the wind, even the crunch of leaves beneath my feet, all of it was gone. The silence was so absolute, it felt like being underwater. My own breathing became a deafening roar in my ears. I quickened my pace, trying to shake off the feeling that the forest itself was closing in on me. I thought I was safe when I finally reached the clearing where I'd parked. But as I approached the car, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were more footprints. They weren't like the ones around my tent. These were larger, deeper, and there were more of them. Dozens, maybe. They crisscrossed the dirt around my car, leading from the tree line to the driver's door and back again, as though something or someone had been pacing around waiting for me. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys. I just needed to get out of there, to drive as far away as possible. I slid into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and turned the key. The engine roared to life, but in the rear-view mirror I saw something standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, too tall, and its limbs were wrong. They bent at odd angles, its arms hanging unnaturally low. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, unblinking, watching. I slammed the gas pedal, tearing down the dirt road faster than I should have, but I didn't care. I needed to get away from that thing, from the lake, from the silence. Even now, days later, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me. At night, when the world gets quiet, I hear footsteps outside my window. And sometimes when I glance at the lake in my backyard, I swear I see that shadow again, standing still, just waiting for me to come back. Because once the silence finds you, it never really lets you go. I've always believed that the woods hold a certain kind of magic, a quiet, peaceful magic that draws you in and allows you to disconnect from the chaos of everyday life. That's why, despite my friends bailing last minute, I decided to head out for a solo camping trip. It was supposed to be relaxing, a weekend of solitude, just me and nature. I couldn't have been more wrong. I chose a spot deep in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, far from any popular trails. The kind of place where you wouldn't run into another soul for miles. That's what I liked about it, the isolation. I packed my gear, hiked in, and set up camp by a small creek that trickled through the dense forest. The sun was setting as I got the fire going, the woods already darkening around me. It wasn't long before I noticed the silence, not the peaceful kind, but the suffocating, heavy kind. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just the crackling of my fire and my own breathing. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that maybe it was just the time of year, or maybe the wildlife was keeping its distance. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. As the night wore on, I began to feel that creeping sense of being watched. It started as a tingle on the back of my neck, the kind you get when you're walking down an empty street, but somehow feel someone's eyes on you. I kept glancing around the fire, into the shadows between the trees, but saw nothing. The feeling persisted, though, gnawing at me, making me feel more and more uneasy. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, it's easy to let your mind run wild when you're alone in the middle of nowhere. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and forced myself to sleep. That's when the footsteps started. At first they were faint, soft crunches on the forest floor, like someone or something was circling my camp. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and they stopped just as suddenly as they started. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out, my heart hammering in my chest. There was nothing there, just the flickering remnants of my dying fire and the darkness of the forest beyond. But I could feel it. Something was out there, watching. I zipped the tent back up and lay there, wide awake, every nerve on edge. The footsteps came again, this time louder, closer. My mouth went dry, and I gripped the knife I kept by my side. I was trying to convince myself it was an animal, but the pattern of the steps, too steady, too human, sent a chill down my spine. They stopped right outside my tent. For what felt like hours, there was nothing but silence. I didn't dare move. I could hear my own heartbeat, the blood rushing in my ears, but outside, nothing. No movement, no sound. Then a soft scraping against the fabric of the tent, slow, deliberate, as if someone was dragging their hand across it. I bit back a scream, squeezing my knife tighter, waiting for something to happen. The scraping continued for a few moments, then stopped. Silence again. I didn't sleep that night. When the first light of dawn broke, I scrambled out of the tent, ready to pack up and leave as fast as possible. But when I stepped outside, my blood ran cold. The ground around my tent was disturbed. Footprints, bare human footprints. They circled my tent over and over again, like someone had been walking around me all night, watching. I was done. I packed up my gear in record time, not caring about how neatly anything went into my bag. I just wanted to get out of there. Fast. But as I turned to head back toward the trail, something caught my eye. There was something hanging from a tree just at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't there the day before, I was sure of it. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me, and I walked over to get a closer look. It was a bundle. A small twisted bundle made of twigs and string hanging from a thin piece of twine. It swayed gently in the morning breeze. As I got closer, I realized there was something else tied to it, something dark, almost black, dried and shriveled. My stomach churned when I recognized it. It was a finger, a human finger. Panic surged through me and I turned and bolted. I ran faster than I ever thought possible, crashing through the woods, not caring about the noise I made or how far I still had to go. My only thought was to get out, to get away from whatever was out there. After what felt like hours of running, I finally made it back to the trailhead. My car was still parked there, the sight of it a relief that almost brought me to my knees. I threw my gear into the back seat and peeled out of there, not once looking back. I didn't tell anyone about what happened for a long time. Who would believe me? A bundle of twigs, a human finger, footsteps circling my tent in the middle of the night. It sounds like something out of a bad horror movie. But it was real. Too real. A few weeks later, I was scrolling through the local news when something caught my eye. A hiker had gone missing in the same area I'd camped. The article said he'd been an experienced outdoorsman, well prepared. But his friends found his campsite abandoned, his tent slashed open from the inside. The search parties found no sign of him, other than one thing. A small bundle of twigs hanging from a tree near his camp. I haven't been camping since, and I don't plan to, ever again.